Welcome back to another VBA tutorial. So in our previous video, we talked about working with template objects inside of Word VBA. And we're gonna now go to the next, well, I say logical, but I really shouldn't say that because it's not logical. Basically what you'll find out is that templates are kind of a high level object that contain a bunch of different collections and smaller objects. And those are building blocks, right? And so if we think about a template can be made up of just different types of building blocks. And those building blocks are basically adding some type of functionality to a Word document, right? So they enhance it, they make it more rich with content, they make it more dynamic where things will update automatically. So there's these building blocks that you can add to your Word document, and it kind of just enhances it, makes it a little bit more dynamic. And what we're going to see is that we can control these building blocks from VBA. Like most things, basically anything really in Office, we can pretty much control it from VBA. So really cool stuff. But it's a big topic and there's a lot of different layers to it. So I do want to kind of just take some time to kind of go over what those layers are and just give you some kind of idea of what a building block is. Okay. So with that being said, let's just first understand what the heck are they? So where do we get them? How do we access them? So you have a Word document open, just like I currently do. And let's say you want to add a building block. So you go over to the Insert tab of your ribbon, and you'll see all this stuff. You can insert tables, headers, footers, cover pages, icons, all sorts of fun stuff. If you go over here to the text portion of that particular ribbon tab, you will see something called Quick Parts. And so if you click Quick Parts, you'll see something called Building Blocks Organizer, right? The building blocks organizer are basically all the building blocks that you have access to. Now, there are pre-built ones, and there's also ones that you, if you want, you can actually create yourself. And you can, again, do this through VBA. Now, we're not going to cover that in this particular video, but maybe at some point, if people are interested, I would be happy to do that. But at this point, these are all your building blocks. Some are more simple than others. So you have things like a works cited, references. You have things like, I don't know, ion. Well, this is a cover page. But just different types of cover pages. You have things like equations. Oh, that's actually kind of neat. You have things like footers. You have things like headers. So really, these are kind of, if you want to think about it, these are your building blocks, right? And so it's just kind of everything there in one simple window, and you can see how all of these building blocks are organized. So there's kind of this high level category, which is like a page number. Well, I guess category actually has its own one, but I guess we'll call this gallery, just whatever, gallery. So it's like gallery is like a page number. You have a category that could be simple. You have built-in with shapes. You have template, so built-in building blocks, so you can actually see where it exists. You have behavior, insert content only, and then you have things like a description, right? So obviously, it kind of gives you an idea as to what they are. So you can see here, like, oh, maybe we want to add a calendar, or we want to add a matrix or a table. We can basically add these different building blocks, right? And so if I click it and I select it, I could edit properties. I could delete it. So that don't delete, never delete, unless you really want it gone. You could insert. If I edit properties, you can edit the name. You can edit which gallery it belongs to, the category, descriptions, where it needs to be saved. Just how basically the behavior behind it, right? So a lot of customizability behind it. Say you did all that and you just want to insert it, right? There you go. You just inserted a building block. In this case, that building block was a table. Okay, so we've inserted this building block. Looks great, but we want to be able to do this from VBA. How do we do that? Well, this is where fun begins. All right, let's go into our Visual Basic editor. Just an FYI, I have a bunch of stuff with this particular video. I won't be writing all of this, obviously, but I want to kind of just take some time to go over what it is, and then more importantly, how are they organized? So I also kind of provide some links too. What are building blocks? Well, this is how Microsoft defines building blocks. A building block is pre-built content similar to auto text that may contain text, images, and formatting. So pre-built content, that's the important part that you need to remember about building blocks. They're pre-built. Basically, it saves you time. You don't have to go back and rebuild something from scratch. You can just take these building blocks, assemble them together, and now you have a wonderful document. Okay, that's great. So we know what building blocks are. From VBA, how are they organized? And this is where things get a little bit interesting. So the building block object model includes 3 objects and 4 collections. All this stuff is just coming from Microsoft. So when you go to that link, you'll see it there. So 3 objects, 4 collections. These enable you to create an organizational structure that works for your specific needs and to modify the structure for a specific solution. Here is a list of all the objects and collections. Oh, forgot to delete that little line right there. Okay, that's fine. So you have building blocks. So a collection of building block entries in a template that are the same type and category. You have a building block object. So that is a specific building block from the building blocks collection. You have building block type and block types. So a collection of building block types and a block type. We'll explain what the difference is later. And then we have categories and category. And then we have building block entries. So this, I like to think of it as like the master collection. It's supposed to contain everything. Now, I've run into some issues, it seems like, when I try to access it. I don't have necessarily a clear answer yet as to why that is. There's not a lot of documentation on this particular topic, so it's a little bit challenging sometimes. But from my interpretation, this was supposed to be the master one. So this contains everything. This is a more specified group of building blocks. So this isn't everybody. This might be all the built-in ones, right? And then the built-in ones can actually have lower level categories, right? So you can have, well, I guess categories in the sense you could have, I guess you could almost think of this almost like your gallery, if you wanted to think of it, like your gallery type. And then this one's like a little bit lower level than that. So the way I look at it is you start here, you go here, this kind of returns this. And then to get to here, I have to go through this. So highest level, I would say like your second highest level, but this one's technically just returning this. And this belongs under this, so under the building blocks. That's the way I like to think about it. But again, if you need to think about it differently, go for it. Okay, so what are the difference between categories and types, right? Because we just saw up here, we have categories and types, and we're not really sure as to what they are. So building blocks are organized by type and category. Building block types are composed of a limited number of word building block type constants. So there's actually a lot of them. There's like 35, but there's a limited number, right? So there's always 35, and there's only going to be 35. There's never more, never less. With categories, you're going to see that's different. So this is kind of like the more structured organizational hierarchy. So this is saying these are the categories. Well, these are the types you get to play with. Once you've defined your type, you can then start defining the categories that belong to that type. So this one's set in stone. This one's a little bit more customizable. So categories, on the other hand, are composed of an unlimited number of strings that you can define to organize your custom building blocks. So building blocks are stored in templates. By default, the templates that are included with Word have building block categories, general and built-in. However, you are not limited to just the categories that are included in these templates. A category can be any string that you define. Types and categories, again, this doesn't really need to be there either. This I want to show you because this, to me, is important. I'm not even going to tell you what I was working on the other day. It's been an interesting one to say the least. Okay, so these are the different building block types, right? So we have auto text, bibliography, cover page, custom auto text, custom headers, equations, footers, headers, page number, bottom, top, tables, table of contents. So just a lot of different types of building blocks, but these are the defined categories. So you can't change this, but there's nothing stopping you from doing a category that belongs to a particular type. So that's just, again, these are the set in stone ones, but categories give you a little bit more control over the process where you can actually organize a little bit better. So again, that was just some context as you're going through this and you're saying like, why is he going here? Why is he going there? This is just trying to give you some kind of idea of how it's organized and how it's all supposed to kind of flow together, right? Okay, so now that we've done that, we're gonna go on to the next part, which is code. Woo! And there's a lot. Hold on, I gotta remember what I called it. Did I change it? What the hell? Oh. Okay. Sub. Working with building blocks. All right. So first thing is we're going to declare our variables. First one is actually going to be something we covered in the last video, which is a template object. Okay, so we have our template object. Again, I kind of already mentioned this. The template contains all the building blocks. Okay, and then we're going to want something called doc block entries. This is just my shorthand notation for declaring a building blocks entries collection object. Okay, so that's, remember, building block entries is kind of like, at least the way I like to think about the master one, so it should contain everything. Doesn't always mean it does. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're now going to go down to quote unquote the next level. Okay, so we'll say doc block types as building block types. And then we have doc block type as building block type. Okay, so these are the defined category. Sorry, I don't want to say categories. Defined types. So these are with the set in stone ones. And then we have doc block categories. And I probably shouldn't use doc block because it's technically a little bit misleading. But this is our categories collection, right? Okay. And then we have our doc block category. Okay. And so this one is just an individual category object. There's this category collection. I don't use it in this one. From what I can tell, the documentation, they weren't using it. So they weren't using it. I'm not using it. Okay. So now that we've done that, let's move on to the next one. And the next one is going to be doc blocks. And so these are just individual building blocks. So we've gotten a collection and now we just want to loop through those particular building blocks. We'll see there's technically an easier way to do it than what I'm going to show you, but I really want you to understand this whole component of how they're organized. So at the end, I'll kind of show you realistically, this is how you should do it, but for educational purposes, I want you to kind of see it a very particular way. Okay, so that's that. And then we're going to be doing a couple things where we have to interact with a range object inside of our document. And then we also are going to be looping, and we're going to see a little bit more challenging with these particular ones. Okay. Let me do this. With this one, we can see there's a template, right? So there's this built-in building blocks. I want to access that one, right? There's different ways I could do it. I would say the safest way is just provide the file path. And so that's basically what I do here. And so I'll just copy this one just to make sure it's safe. This is what I would call the most stable way. So you go into your application object, you go into the templates collection. We know it's a collection, so you can access it different ways. I don't like using the index in this particular example because I feel like it can change very frequently depending on how things are potentially opened and organized. So I would say to play it safe, just provide the file path. It's a little bit longer, but I think it's a little bit safer. So here, grab the building block, built in building blocks template. Okay, so we've done that. That's all fine. Great. And then all I'm doing here is I'm just simply printing that name. Okay, so the template name is built-in building blocks.dotx. Perfect. Nothing hopefully too complicated at this point. Okay, so we have our template. Our template contains the building blocks. How do we access it, right? So the first thing we'll do is we'll grab the building block entries collection. So that's supposed to be everybody. I'll show you kind of some issues I ran into. If somebody comes up with a solution, I'd be happy to hear about it because I think I'm missing something, but I'm not necessarily sure what it is. So I go into my template object, and then there's a property called building block entries. So this one, all it does is grab the building block entries collection. Okay, so that is a collection of all the building blocks. For the most part, collections are very limited into the information they provide, but maybe we want to know, for example, how many building block entries are in there, for example, right? So again, just to save a little bit of time. For the printing stuff, I don't really care too much if it's on something else. Okay, so this one is just going to say the count. So this is just telling us how much are in this particular collection in that particular document. That's all it is. So this one's saying there are 241. So there's a lot. There's a lot of building block components in this. So this is, again, supposed to be everybody. It's interesting, though, because, like I said, sometimes issues do arise where if you have certain ones loaded and then you don't do it correctly, potentially this number could actually be wrong. So just be cognizant of that. If you're running into errors, it might just be best start with a new document that doesn't have any reference to the old one and then try writing the code and see if that fixes it, because you'd be surprised sometimes that that's enough. That's enough for the most part. Okay, so here comes the interesting part. When certain items have certain properties, other ones don't, right? So not everything in that collection is going to have the same information. So for example, I could print the name of a building block, right? So we'll grab one, right? So we'll say doc block entries, and then if we go to the item, and let's just say we'll do one and we'll do name, right? So nothing fancy. Oh, sorry, I didn't put debug print. I was like, don't tell me there's another error. I don't need that. So here, nothing too fancy. I'll run it again so that way you can clearly see it. It's just printing the name, right? I could do this again, and we'll see what that one does. And we'll say, okay, item 2, and okay, ASAP 2, nothing fancy. I could try category. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Oh, not that. This is one that doesn't work. So you just have to keep in mind, it's everybody. So this is a collection of all the building blocks. Not all the building blocks have the same information. So you just have to be aware of that as you're looping. You can't assume everybody's going to have the same property and that it's always going to be available. Sometimes that will get you in trouble. And if you're not aware of that, you'll kind of be scratching. It's like, why is this not working, right? Nothing too fancy. Okay, so the next thing I do want to talk about is looping. So looping through these collections is not the same as you would think, right? So normally when we loop through collections, right? Just say, for example, I create a new variable. I'm not even going to use the ones we declared up above. We'll just say it doc block 2 in doc block entries, right? And then I'll do next. And then let's just say I try to debug print doc block 2 dot name, right? So I just do all that. I'm pretty straightforward. Oh, interesting. We can't loop using a for each loop. It won't let us. So this is the only collection I've ever encountered where I cannot use a for each loop. You actually have to use a for I loop, or I guess say just a regular for loop. So what you would have to do instead is we're going to take that int count that int count variable up here, and we're going to initialize it to 1, and we're going to say loop through for int count 1, 2 doc. So we're going to take this collection and we're going to call the count property. And so what we'll do is we'll take this, we'll call the item method, and then we'll say int count. This is how you loop through building block collections. You cannot use a for each loop. I'm going to say that again. You cannot use a for each loop. You have to use a for loop, a regular for loop. Don't ask me why. I yet to find out why. But when you do that, the loops work as you would expect, so no issues there. But again, you have to be a little bit cognizant. Some will have certain properties and some won't. So you just have to be careful when you're looping. So all I'm doing here is loop through the building block entries collection. Do not use a for each loop. And I used a little exclamation mark. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's move on to the next one, building block types, right? So this is kind of that next level category. This returns everybody. If I want a subset, so just a particular group of it, that's fine. I can do that, but we need to use building block types. Okay, so the first thing we can do is sometimes what I like to do is I just kind of like to print some information, and this is also going to help validate some information we already know about building block types, right? And what I'll do here is I like to have it nice and broken up so that way there's no issues. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to count the building block types in my particular document, and then I'm also going to set my doc block types object collection to the word template building block types. So I want you to be very aware of something when you're done. Interesting. 35. That makes sense. We know there's only 35 enumerations, so that shouldn't be surprising. So in essence, what we're really doing here is, I would almost say you're taking that like enumeration collection and you can start grabbing specific pieces of it. So it's an interesting component, but it's there and it kind of gives you some flexibility as to how you want to approach it. So we have our building block types collection. Let's go through the next process, which is looping through it again. And so again, because it's this building block collection, we cannot use a for each loop. We have to use the count, okay? So just keep that in mind. Loop through the building block types collection. Ooh. Okay, so that's fine. What you could also do is up here, I just kind of was writing out each line. You could technically, if you want, set the object variable inside the loop. So you can say doc block type equals my doc blocks, block types. And then I can do my int count. Now it's also, I did want to kind of show that to you. It's not gonna let me, is it? You can see you have the enumeration if you want to. this is a very special enumeration. Well, I guess it's not. I guess I've encountered it before. This just so happens to go in numeric order. So I'm sure some of you have worked with enumerations in the past, and you'll know they don't always go consecutively. That's why normally, if I was going to do this and just trying to do the count, it wouldn't work, because if they weren't in that particular order, then it would try to access a particular one and it'd be like, well, it doesn't exist. Well, it's just because that loop didn't, we just haven't reached that part of the loop yet. So that's why this particular collection is very special, because everything is in consecutive order. So that's why we're basically able to do this for loop. Otherwise, we would have had a whole big old headache. And honestly, I don't know if I would have been able to figure out how to fix it, because you would have to know somehow all the information up above, ahead of time. And I guess you could maybe figure out some logic behind it, but it would not be pretty. So that's just, more information for you. So set object variable. And then from here, I would just say we're doing nothing crazy fancy. We're just kind of printing some information about these particular building blocks. And so because of that, again, I'm just going to kind of copy that component and we'll just add it in here. Okay. So all this is going to do is it's going to print the name. It's going to do the index. So the index is pretty straightforward. We've worked with this one before. And then this one is also, we're basically getting the next level down. So at the block type, the building block type level, we have that categories collection, and then this one's telling us how many categories are in it. So pretty interesting stuff. Just for some readability, I'm going to kind of turn off some of these other loops so that way it's not overwhelming you with a bunch of information. But you can see there's a bunch of different building block types. So we have quick parts. Some do not have categories. And so that's why we were running into issues up here. Because, for example, do you notice that when I tried item 1, it didn't have a category? And so this one, with item 2, we actually probably would have had some success. I probably would have had to do a name or something like that. But what it's trying to tell you is that's why we were running into issues up here, because we can't assume everybody has a category. Certain things we can assume everybody has, like a name, an index, like those are for the most part usually always there. But things like categories, they might not necessarily have that. And then some building block types have more categories than others. So for example, page number has 6, tables has 1, watermarks have 3. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're looping through this, that you can get some variation and you have to be ready for that variation when you're writing your code. And you have to be able to handle it as necessary. So just be aware of that. Okay, so let's assume we've looped through it and now we want to grab one particular document type, right? In this example, let's grab the tables, right? I like tables. Tables are cool. So we'll do that. There's 2 ways of grabbing that particular that building block type. One is using the enumeration, so the actual number, and one is using the constant. So that is the, I guess you could call it the key in a sense. One's using the index and one's using the key. If I just wanted to be very, very, very specific. So method 1, we'll just call it the index, right? And so we'll say set doc block type equal to doc block types, and then it's 21. So 21 is tables, and you can actually look here. It's custom tables, but it's also tables too. It's weird. You would think like, oh, it's not the same, right? No, it apparently is. And then the second way is method 2. So method 2 is we'll use that quote unquote key method. And so with this one, I'm going to make it where you can see a little bit better. We'll do doc block type equals doc block types. In this one, I want tables. So that's the second way of doing it. So hopefully that's pretty intuitive. And For the most part, nothing too complicated at this point. We're just accessing an individual one. It's very similar to what we were doing here, but this one, it was dynamically changing as we were looping. This one's more static, so it's staying the same. Okay, and then again, we're just going to be printing some stuff, so anything printing related is just like that. Okay, so I'm going to clear this all out. And we can see building blocks, and then it has an index of 7. Oh, I think I misspoke up above. Sorry, my apologies. The enumeration is different than the index. Let me change this because I don't like that now. I shouldn't have put that down. We'll call it just the constant. Whatever, that's fine. The enumeration is a little bit different. I shouldn't have used index. That's kind of misleading. And that's kind of telling you why, because you're like, well, Alex, you did 21, but it says an index of 7. Technically, you can now see it's a little bit 2 different things. Okay, so that's pretty cool. We now have a building block type. Let's say we want to go down to the next level. So we want to go down to categories. Well, that's assuming that the building block type has categories. So this is where I'm going to kind of write our code a little bit differently. So that way, if we encounter a document block type that doesn't have a category, it won't fail on us. So what we're going to do is we're going to say doc block type, if the count is greater than 0, then, and then else, and if, okay? So what we'll do is we'll say, if you do have categories, then say debug print this type, and then plus doc block type dot name plus bracket has plus convert string doc block type categories dot count, and then plus categories that, okay, hopefully that's right. And then this next one will be debug print this type has no categories. Okay, there you go. So this is just making it a little bit more robust, so that way, you know, handle the situation where a building block type has no categories. That's all it's doing right here. So if it's greater than 0, so if the category count is greater than 0, it will print that category count for us. And then if it's not, then it will just print there are no categories. So let's see how many tables we have. Has 1 category. Well, that makes it simple. Makes it simple than having to go through 20 of them. Okay, so just like we've done in the past, we're just going to go down to the next level. So I'm going to copy this little section right here and we'll put it in our code. So now we're in building block categories, right? So we're going to set our document block categories collection object equal to our doc block type object, and then we're going to call that categories property that will return that collection to us. So basically exactly what we've been doing up above for each one of them. Okay, so now that we've done that, most of it, again, it's just printing and it's just kind of doing the same stuff we've done before. So I'm not going to kind of, you know, sound like a broken record. Again, we have to use a for loop because these collections, they're not the same as ones we've worked with in the past. So we have to use a for loop. And then I basically did exactly what I was doing up here. I was just setting my object variable inside my loop, and then I just print some information. So I print the name, I have the index, but you can see there's, you know, an application creator index. You know, there's a lot of stuff there. You know, if you need it, you can access it. For the most part, though, it's just more informative. I don't think it's giving you anything, at least at this point, that is useful. So we just kind of have to leave it as is. So what we'll do is we'll run this and see what we get. Okay, so this type has one category. The category has a name of built-in. So it's a built-in category, and then it has an index of 3. So pretty cool, right? So now that we've done that, I'm going to show you again, accessing it is, and I'm going to change the names again too, because it's bothering me. We'll do the enumeration, and then we'll do the constant. The same as above, we're just accessing it using the index, or not the index, the enumeration. And then obviously too, with this one I guess technically I would say this is more key index, because there aren't category enumerations. These are all defined. And so, yeah, and then it's going to change obviously as you add. So your indexes, yeah, we'll keep this one actually index and key. But to access it, we can either do the index or we can provide the key, so the category name. And then this will obviously access that particular building block category, if you want to think of it like that. Okay, so now that we've done that, we'll go down to basically our next lowest level, which is building blocks, right? So this is basically what we've been trying to get to the entire time, right? So this was the whole thing that we were trying to get to, was the building blocks. We got there, it just took a little bit, and I'll show you, we don't technically have to do this every time. There's a simpler way of doing it, but I do think it's important that we understand how this is all organized. Okay, so what we do is we take our category object, and there is a property, as we've seen, called building blocks. That returns the building blocks collection. So that collection is made up of individual building block objects. All I do is I assign that collection to my doc blocks object variable, which is a collection. And then here, I'm just printing a very big string that just tells me how many building blocks are in that category that belong to that building block type. So it's just printing out a very long string that's trying to give you some insight as to how it's all connected. So there are 9 built-in categories, or sorry, 9 building blocks in that built-in category that belong to the table's type. So we have our type, we have our category, and that category contains building blocks. That's all you need to know. Okay, so let me ask the question. What if we want to iterate over it? What do we do? You guessed it. It's exactly the same as everything else. We have to do a for loop. We have to do a regular for loop. It's just like everything else. So we just do a count. All I'm doing here, I'm just setting the object variable. I'm printing some information. Now, you'll see there's actually some more information here, but we'll work with that in a second. So let's see what we got. So you can see here, we have a double table, tabular list, matrix, with subheads 2, so on and so on and so on. So remember, if I go to my insert tab and then I go to my text portion and then I click my quick parts drop down, and I go to my building blocks organizer, this is all the building blocks, right? So technically we are on this one right here. So we're at the tables type, we're in the built-in category, and now we have the individual building blocks. So double table, calendar with subhead, matrix, and then tabular list. So at this point, we now have our individual building blocks. These ones are a little bit more complex because they represent entire table objects. However, you can have more simple ones. So they could just be something like an auto text component. They could be, just a text box, nothing really fancy. It just depends what you're working with. Okay, so let's grab a single building block and work with it. So grab a single building block. In this case, a width subheads 1. Perfect. Okay, so you probably can assume this. We can use the index or the key if we want. So in this particular example, again, it is truly an index. So we can say method 1 is index, and then so we'll set our doc block equal to doc blocks. And in this case, the particular building block we want has an index of 4. Let's assume you did not know the particular index. Well, there's another way you could do it as well. You could just provide that particular key. And so you can do with subheads 1. I was reading somewhere, I guess, maybe it's with categories. I can't remember exactly. Some of them actually, what is it? They're not case sensitive, so you might be able to do like lowercase w and it would still return the same information. So this is something to kind of be aware of. You might actually have it work multiple times in different instances. So again, just something to be aware of. Okay, so again, just because we're printing some information, I'm not going to kind of retype everything. I'm going to print the name, the description, the category name. Now, in this case, I know it belongs to a category, the ID, and the value. So this is interesting. I'll just show it to you because I thought it was a little bit fascinating. So name, we already know that. Description, so this is just telling what that building block is. The category, well, we kind of already knew that. The ID is interesting. I want to say it's a GUID. At least that's what it looks like. So I'd have to look a little bit more and maybe read the documentation to kind of see what that's all about. But I think it's a GUID. So that might be indicative of some other stuff we might be able to do to it. I don't know. We'll have to see. The block value is interesting. It seems to return all the content that's actually in the table. So you can see it's the actual table content itself, but it's printing it out. So I thought that was interesting. Again, I've worked with things in the past, but I think that was a first where I've ever come across and I'm like, oh, it's actually printing the entire content. So again, that's just, getting some information. We do all this fun stuff. Now, the fun thing is, okay, that's great. How do we go about actually inserting this building block? So let's insert a building block. We have to provide a range of where we're going to insert this building block, or where we want to insert it. So to kind of just show you, I guess, a different way of doing something, let's get that range, we'll define it, we'll store it in a variable, and then we'll pass it through when we're trying to insert it. So I'm going to declare a variable. It's called endRange. I'm going to take my active document. I'm going to go into my paragraphs collection. I want my first paragraph. I want that range object. And then that range has an end property. So that is the ending position of the character count. So it returns a long. So grab the end character of paragraph 1. Very important to remember, this is returning a long. So it's not an object, it's just a long data type. So with that, we can now go to the next part, which is define the range. So define the range where we want to insert. I've seen different, I guess, ways of doing this. This is, at this point, it's all the same. So we declare our word range, we set our word range object variable. I still go to my active document. I still go to my range, but with the range object, we have a start argument, 0. So we want the 0 position of the character. And then we have an end, which is end range. I've seen people, for whatever reason, put 1 and it seems to work. But for whatever reason, I've had it work and then not work. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So we'll see. It should work fine. I'm hoping. If it doesn't, it's obviously going to give us an error. But all this is doing is it's defining that range. So it's defining the starting character position and the ending character position. So technically speaking, it is saying it's going from 0, I guess, to 1, or at least whatever the ending range is. Technically, I don't have any spaces or characters, so I'm assuming it would still be 0, but I'd have to write the code to actually physically see it. But that's basically what it's doing. So now that you've done that, we can take our building block object. We can call the insert method. It has an argument called where, and I just need to provide a range object. So it just needs to be a range object. And then there is this this other additional argument called rich text. So rich text formatting. I want that, so I just set it equal to true. You don't have to do it. You can completely set it to false and it will work exactly the same. So insert the building block. To be honest, I've never even tried, what it would look like. So let's see what happens. Hopefully no issues. Okay, so it looks like it worked fine. I would call that a success. What I'm going to do next is just kind of show you what happens maybe if we change this to false. You can see I guess it kind of more puts it more to like the document style. Yeah, because I guess this is Roboto, so that works fine. But yeah, so that's just a formatting thing. There's nothing fancy there. The last thing I want to talk about. Hopefully that's enough warnings for you. Okay, there is a delete method. You have to be very, very careful with it. I learned the hard way about doing this. And then I realized I didn't actually cause that much of an issue because I didn't save it, so it was fine. If you delete it and you were to save your documents, you would permanently delete that building block. So any of the built-in ones, you have the potential to actually delete any of them or all of them, and it's not going to stop you from deleting the built-in ones. Additionally, once they're gone, they're gone. They're gone if you save it. So just if you accidentally delete it, just do not save your document. That's all it is. Sorry, you're just going to have to go back in time. Because once you save it, it's going to ask you if you want to make changes to that built-in building blocks document template. Say no. Because like I said, once you save it, you've permanently deleted it. The only way you would be able to fix it is I would assume you probably would have to download it again or maybe even reinstall. I doubt you'd have to reinstall, but you probably would have to download it again. So yes, there is a delete method. Be very, very cautious when you use it. I would only use it on ones that you have built yourself or ones that you know for sure you will never want again, and you could care less if they're gone. So I will not run it, but it is there in case you want to know if it exists. It does exist. All right, so with that being said, that does finish this video. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below and I will try to get back to you. And then, like I said in the last video, what's coming up? Well, we've got connection objects in Excel VBA, and then we have another user form that I was going to show. And then we're going to go jump into SQL. We're going to talk about pivot and unpivot. We're going to talk about dynamic pivot, working with JSON data, working with XML data, cross join. What's the other one? Upsert, merge. So it's like a merge. So we'll see that one. So that's kind of with SQL, and then JavaScript API. What we're going to be doing is building an add-in. I'm not going to tell you much of what we're doing because I'm still trying to validate if I can actually get it to work. But if we can get it to work, all I will say is Win32Com people, you will be very, very happy. So that's all I'm going to say. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We will see you in the next video.